What if I told you that some of the most horrific stories you've ever heard about colonialism, the ones that sound so brutal they seem like fiction, were actually watered-down versions of reality, that the truth was so much worse than anything a novelist could imagine? Today, I'm diving into a memoir that will make you question everything you thought you knew about colonial Africa. But first, let me tell you a story about a young boy who almost suffocated himself, chose education over train rides, and witnessed his world torn apart by forces he barely understood. Trust me, you're going to want to stick around for this one. Picture this. It's colonial Kenya, and there's a young boy living in his father's compound. Now, this isn't your typical coming-of-age story where the biggest problem is getting asked to prom. No, this kid is dealing with British colonizers who literally think his people are subhuman, while also trying not to accidentally kill himself in the most absurd ways possible. And speaking of almost dying, our protagonist nearly suffocates himself at one point. I won't spoil exactly how, but let's just say kids will find a way to endanger themselves no matter what century they're living in. Some things never change, apparently. But here's where things get really complicated. This boy's family situation is, well, let's call it unconventional. He ends up moving from his father's compound to his mother's place, which is also his grandfather's compound. Family dynamics in colonial Kenya, it's complicated. Now, his mother and I have to give credit where it's due. This woman has serious foresight. She looks at her son and thinks, you know what? Education. That's the ticket out of this mess. And she's willing to sacrifice everything for it. We're talking about a time when getting an education meant potentially losing your cultural identity, but she knew it was the only way forward. Speaking of education, let me paint you a picture of what school looked like back then. Imagine if your local church decided to run the entire education system, but their main curriculum was How to Hate Yourself and Your Culture 101. The missionaries had a monopoly on education, and they used it like a weapon. They basically said, want to learn to read? Cool, but first you need to believe that everything about your ancestors was evil, and our God is the only real one. And get this, baptismal certificates became like social security numbers. You literally couldn't deal with the government without one. It's like if today you needed a certificate proving you'd been to a Taylor Swift concert before you could get a driver's license.
What? Yeah.
Absolutely wild. But here's where it gets really interesting and infuriating. The native people weren't just sitting around accepting this. They created their own schools with their own curriculum, teaching their own children about their own culture. Revolutionary, right? Well, the colonial government took one look at this and said, nope, can't have that, and shut them down faster than you can say educational freedom. They only allowed schools that taught the colonizer-approved subjects. It's like if someone came to your hometown and said, you can only teach math if you agree that 2 + 2 = 5. Now let's talk about the religious angle because, oh boy, it's a doozy. The priests running these schools weren't just teaching reading and writing. They were essentially running a cultural erasure program. They demanded students abandon everything traditional about themselves. If you embraced European culture, you were considered advanced, basically the teacher's pet on a continental scale. And some of these converts, they became worse than their colonizers. There's this character, Reverend Stanley Kahahu, who, after becoming a priest, apparently decided he was too good for his own people. This guy started taking land from rightful owners, backed by his new colonial friends. And his wife? Don't even get me started. She treated everyone, especially non-Christians, like dirt. It's like when someone gets a tiny bit of authority and suddenly forgets where they came from. Except the stakes were people's homes and livelihoods. But wait, there's more. While all this is happening locally, there's also this little thing called World War II going on. African soldiers, including Kenyans, went off to help the British fight Hitler and his Nazi ideology. They're over there fighting against racism and oppression, right? Meanwhile, back home, the British colonial government is implementing their own version of segregation and apartheid. The irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife. And when these African soldiers came home, the white soldiers got large tracts of land as payment for their service. The black soldiers, their families had been displaced to make room for those white soldiers. Imagine fighting for freedom and democracy, only to come home and find your family homeless so your former allies could get a nice retirement package. This leads to the Mau Mau uprising, a resistance movement that tore the country apart. And here's the really twisted part. The most brutal force fighting against the Mau Mau weren't the British soldiers. They were the Home Guard's local people, sometimes from the same families as the resistance fighters, who chose to side with the colonizers and tortured their own neighbors. Brothers fighting brothers, neighbors turning on neighbors. It's like a civil war, but with the added complexity of colonialism thrown in. Our young protagonist is living through all of this chaos. He's watching his world literally tear itself apart while he's trying to figure out basic things like whether to stay in school or ride a train. At one point, he actually has to choose between fulfilling his childhood dream of riding a train and keeping his promise to his mother to stay in school. Imagine having to make that choice as a kid, between wonder and responsibility, between dreams and survival. The transportation infrastructure being built, those roads and railways, might seem like progress, but they were really just more tools of oppression. They led straight to areas rich in resources, making it easier for colonizers to extract wealth. And they literally paved the way for missionaries to reach more remote areas. It's infrastructure, but with very specific exploitative purposes. Throughout all of this, our narrator is just a kid trying to make sense of an adult world gone completely insane. He gets beaten by a British soldier for not adding "effendi," a term of respect, to his statements. He goes without food in pursuit of education. He participates in traditional rites of passage while also navigating a colonial education system designed to make him ashamed of those very traditions.
Damn.
This young boy witnessing all of this chaos, this systematic destruction of his culture while fighting for his education and future, this boy grew up to become one of Africa's most important voices in literature.
Remind me who that is again?
The memoir I've been telling you about is Dreams in a Time of War by Ngugi wa Thiong'o. This isn't fiction, folks. Every single thing I just described actually happened to a real person. And that person went on to become one of Africa's most celebrated writers. This book was published in 2011, though the original came out in 2010, and it's 257 pages of absolutely riveting memoir that reads like the most intense historical fiction you've ever encountered, except it's all true. Let me be completely honest with you, this book wrecked me. And not just because of the obvious horrors of colonialism, though those are certainly present and devastating. What really got to me was how Ngugi manages to show us the complexity of human nature under extreme circumstances. One of the most powerful themes in this memoir is the idea that oppression doesn't create heroes and villains. It reveals who people really are. Take Reverend Kahahu and his wife. They didn't become terrible people because they gained a little power. The power just made their existing character traits more visible. Ngugi makes this brilliant observation that a person does not lose his character when he acquires power. His traits become pronounced. It's almost like, power is a magnifying glass for the soul. And this connects to a larger, more uncomfortable truth that Ngugi explores, the cycle of oppression. He points out that countries often do to others exactly what they once fought against. The British fought Nazi oppression in Europe while implementing equally brutal systems in their colonies. Later, some African leaders who fought for independence turned around and oppressed their own people in similar ways. It's this depressing pattern where freedom fighters sometimes just want their turn at being the oppressor. What's particularly brilliant about this memoir is how Ngugi presents these complex ideas through a child's perspective. He's not giving us a political treatise. He's showing us how these massive historical forces played out in the daily life of one family, one village, one boy trying to get an education. The personal becomes political in the most literal sense. The writing style itself is masterful. Ngugi switches between past and present tense in a way that makes you feel like you're right there with him. You're not reading about these events, you're experiencing them. When he describes being beaten by that British soldier, you feel the humiliation and confusion of a child who doesn't understand why he's being punished for something as simple as how he speaks. Another theme that really struck me is the role of education as both liberation and colonization. Ngugi's mother understood that education was the only path forward for her son, but that education came with strings attached, namely, the systematic destruction of their cultural identity. It's this impossible choice: stay ignorant and maintain your culture, or get educated and lose yourself. The fact that this was even a choice shows just how insidious colonialism was. The book also serves as a perfect example of why memoirs matter in ways that fiction sometimes can't. As Ngugi himself points out in the book, people can dismiss fiction as fantasy, but it's much harder to ignore a memoir. When someone says this actually happened to me, it carries a weight that even the most powerful novel can't match. And speaking of Ngugi's other works, if you've read any of his novels like Weep Not Child or A Grain of Wheat, this memoir gives you insight into where all those stories came from. You can see the real experiences that shaped his fictional worlds. It's like getting the director's commentary on his entire body of work. What's particularly relevant today is how Ngugi connects historical colonialism to neocolonialism. He warns against Africans who continue to sell out their continent for personal gain, and honestly, this feels incredibly current. The mechanisms of exploitation might have changed, but the fundamental dynamics often remain the same. But perhaps the most important message of this memoir is about resilience and the long view of progress. Ngugi went through incredible hardships just to get a basic education, struggles that he argues shouldn't exist in independent Kenya today. He's giving us a measuring stick for progress. How far have we come from the world he describes? The book also doesn't shy away from showing the moral complexity of resistance movements. The Mau Mau fighters weren't perfect heroes, and the colonial collaborators weren't cartoon villains. They were all people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Some chose based on principle, others on survival, still others on personal advancement. Ngugi shows us that history is made by real people with mixed motives, not by the simplified characters we often see in textbooks. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is truly one of Africa's literary giants. Born in 1938 in colonial Kenya, as we've seen from this memoir, he went on to become a novelist, playwright, and literary critic whose work has been translated into dozens of languages worldwide. What makes Ngugi particularly interesting is his commitment to writing in his native Kikuyu language, rather than English. This was a conscious political choice, a rejection of the linguistic colonialism he experienced as a child. He's argued that language is not just a tool of communication, but a carrier of culture, and that by forcing Africans to think and create in European languages, colonialism continued even after political independence. His novels, including Weep Not Child, The River Between, and A Grain of Wheat, all explore themes of colonialism, independence, and post-colonial identity. But they're not just political treatises. They're beautifully crafted stories that capture the human experience of living through these massive historical changes. Ngugi has faced persecution for his political views. He was imprisoned by the Kenyan government in the 1970s and later forced into exile. He lived in the United States, where he taught at UC Irvine, but his heart and his writing remain deeply connected to Africa and its struggles for true freedom and dignity. Dreams in a Time of War is more than just a memoir. It's a window into a crucial period of African history, told by someone who lived it and went on to become one of its most important chroniclers. It's a reminder that the stories we think are too terrible to be true are often not terrible enough. But it's also, ultimately, a story of hope. Here's a boy who almost suffocated himself, who had to choose between train rides and education, who watched his world tear itself apart, and he not only survived, but used his experiences to become a voice for justice and human dignity. If you're interested in African history, colonial studies, or just want to read a brilliantly crafted memoir that will change how you see the world, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. It's available in most bookstores and definitely worth adding to your reading list. What did you think of this review? Have you read any of Ngugi's other works? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more book reviews that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey, thanks so much for hanging out with me today. If you're interested in diving deeper into this book, I've left some links down in the description. You can use it to grab yourself a copy and keep the adventure going. And if you're in the mood for more great reads, don't go just yet. Click on one of the videos popping up right now that I think you'll love. And don't forget to give this review a like, leave a comment, or even subscribe if you'd like to see more. Every bit of support helps us grow this little community of book lovers. See you in the next one.